What if the elegant image of the Victorian age was a complete lie? What if behind lace curtains and polished manners hid a world of rot, screams, and secrets? The 19th century gave us science, empire, and progress, but it also gave us some of the darkest human horrors. Each chapter in this series uncovers a twisted truth they desperately wanted to bury. The final chapter reveals a brutal practice so shocking, it was erased from official records entirely. But before we dive in, let me know if you're enjoying this kind of long, gentle history. Feel free to tap that like button and subscribe, only if you truly love what I'm doing here. And in the comments, share where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your city. I always love seeing our little bedtime crew gathering from every corner of the world. Now lower your lights, maybe let a soft fan hum in the background, and settle in. Let's ease into tonight's quiet journey together. Chapter 1: The Cannibal Cures of Victorian Medicine. It began in silence. A pale boy lay on a blood-soaked cot, sweat pooling in the hollows of his eyes. The doctor leaned in with a spoon, not filled with medicine, but with powdered human skull. The dust clung to the boy's lips as he coughed, trying to reject the remedy forced upon him. In the Victorian era, this was not a punishment. It was a cure. Physicians across Britain prescribed bits of human bone, ground up mummies, and liquid flesh with the same confidence modern doctors offer aspirin. To them, the body was a machine that could be jump-started by the life force of another, even a dead one, and no one questioned it, not the elites, not the royals, not even the patients. They trusted the white coat, the jar on the shelf, the blood-red solution dripping down their throats. What they did not know was that the cure could very well consume them from the inside out. In grand hospitals and grimy alley clinics, doctors reached into history's most grotesque cabinet. Egyptian mummies were ground into powder, sold in apothecaries, and stirred into wines as a general remedy for everything from headaches to tuberculosis. This wasn't ancient superstition. It was cutting-edge Victorian science. Apothecaries bought human fat scraped from corpses. Blood collected from the freshly executed was bottled, warm, and swallowed by epileptics seeking a cure. Organs were stolen from cemeteries and preserved in jars, believed to retain some spark of life. These substances weren't illegal. They were fashionable. The more exotic, the more revered. The rich could afford older mummies. The poor settled for whatever could be snatched or boiled. It was not called cannibalism. It was therapy. It blurred the line between healer and butcher, between doctor and grave robber. But the worst part, it worked, just enough to keep the horror alive. Behind the heavy doors of London's finest hospitals, one could hear the clinking of surgical tools and the quiet sobs of patients held down. There was no anesthesia in the early days, only alcohol or the crushing grip of an orderly. Limbs were sawed off in seconds. Screams echoed through marble corridors. Infections were common. And when patients survived, it was often because of the unthinkable, the application of warm human fat. Victorians believed the essence of life could be transferred through touch or ingestion. If your liver failed, a fresh one, human or not, might restore balance. Physicians were chemists, necromancers, and gamblers. They measured the pulse like it was a ticking bomb. And to defuse it, they relied on cadavers. Not all donated, many not even cold. This was not healing. It was resurrection, repurposed. And for every life that limped on, many others had already paid the price, body and soul. In private drawing rooms, dinner parties turned into medical exhibitions. Wealthy Victorians loved strange cures as much as they loved gossip. Bottles labeled "Elixir of Life" contained traces of dried blood, often collected from prisons or battlefield hospitals. Mothers fed their ailing children syrup laced with mercury and crushed skull. One traveling remedy seller offered powdered brain as a memory enhancer. The gentry drank these concoctions beside their wine, believing health could be bought, bottled, and consumed. But beneath this facade of progress lay desperation. The era was plagued with unknown diseases, from scarlet fever to cholera, and modern medicine had few answers. So society turned to the past, to ancient rituals, to folklore, and to death itself. The older the cure, the more potent they believed it was. And in their hunger for health, the Victorians consumed themselves, piece by piece, generation by generation, until the line between patient and predator vanished in the mist of ignorance. Children were not spared from this horror. In orphanages and rural clinics, they were fed broths boiled from bone and given pills made from pulverized skin. If a child had seizures, the cure might be a blood transfusion from a man freshly executed. Doctors claimed it passed courage and vitality from the criminal to the innocent. Nurses wiped away tears with cloths soaked in tinctures of marrow. These treatments weren't experimental, they were standard. There was no room for fear. If a child died, another would follow to test a new blend. There were always more children, and fewer witnesses. The medical journals of the time, if read today, would feel more at home in the horror section of a library. But back then, they were gospel. Every chart was a testimony to desperation. Every cure a quiet scream from a child too weak to resist. And every physician saw themselves as a savior, even as they administered death disguised as healing. The supply chain for these cannibal cures stretched across continents. Egyptian tombs were plundered, not by thieves, but by collectors with medical licenses. Entire mummies were unwrapped in public theaters, dissected for parts, and auctioned to the highest bidder. The powder from these ancient bodies was so profitable, it became an export. Apothecaries sold it as mumia. Gravediggers across Europe contributed to the market. Cadavers were stolen, skinned, and reduced to ingredients. Some even used criminals sentenced to death as a supply line, executed not for justice but for medicine. In one twisted corner of Victorian London, the line between hangman and pharmacist grew dangerously thin. The dead were no longer mourned. They were monetized. And as long as there were patients to feed, the machines of death turned endlessly. The public never saw the chain. Only the jar, the spoon, the hope. But someone always paid. Not in coin, but in flesh. As science advanced, so did the precision of the horror. Physicians began experimenting with injections of human blood, believing it could transfer strength and morality. Some patients received the blood of animals in desperate trials. When results were poor, they turned back to humans. Some were volunteers, others were not. In rural asylums, where supervision was scarce, tests were conducted without consent. Blood was drawn, organs transplanted, and failure was buried. Hospitals published sanitized reports. But behind closed doors, the truth was far grimmer. Doctors believed themselves to be pioneers, but many were little more than licensed tormentors. They weren't trying to hurt, but they were willing to hurt for progress. That justification cloaked every failure, every scream, every lost soul. This was not science fiction. It was science history, and in this chapter, progress looked more like possession than practice. Each success came soaked in suffering, and each cure built atop a grave. Even Queen Victoria's own physicians endorsed these remedies. Some believed that ingesting dried hearts could ward off melancholy. Others claimed that human bone powder boosted vitality in old age. Royal hospitals kept stocks of exotic tinctures, many containing crushed human remains, under lock and key. These were not folk remedies. They were prestige treatments, fashionable, exclusive, and deadly. Some aristocrats even funded their own apothecaries to prepare custom blends using ingredients sourced from colonial expeditions. The empire fed the sick. Quite literally, bodies from across the world were reduced to paste and powder in the name of imperial medicine. Colonies were stripped of both life and death. The Victorians believed they had conquered nature. But what they had truly conquered was the line between the sacred and the savage. The practice wasn't hidden. It was flaunted, and the elite drank from silver cups, never wondering how many bodies had to be boiled to fill them. The newspapers of the day rarely questioned these methods. Medical advertisements filled the pages, promising miraculous cures using essence of human vitality or powdered ancient remains. Testimonies praised the quick results. No one asked where the ingredients came from. Pharmacies displayed skull-shaped jars as if they were no different from peppermint lozenges. The public believed what they were told. These were medicines, not monstrosities. And for the few who dared to ask, silence or ridicule often followed. Skeptics were brushed off as superstitious or backwards. To challenge the cure was to insult progress. It created a society where death fed the living, and the living marched on, unaware they were part of something far older and darker than they imagined. A hunger for health had turned into a quiet cannibalism, socially accepted, medically encouraged, and morally ignored. The body became a currency, and the illness, a gateway to something far more terrifying than death. But not all were silent victims. In the darker corners of London, some patients began to suspect the truth. They noticed the stains on the bottles, the unusual taste, the faint scent of decay. Rumors spread among the poor, whispers of dead men's bones being used in medicine. Some refused treatment only to be labeled mad or ungrateful. In truth, they were correct. The working class could not afford denial. Their medicine came in dirty jars with no labels. They saw the shipments, smelled the rot, and while the wealthy sipped their cures with silver spoons, the poor knew the cost. It was their dead who filled the bottles, their bodies that lined the shelves, their blood that dripped into another's veins. In a world where knowledge was hoarded, suspicion became the only shield. But it was a weak one, and as fear turned to acceptance, even the whispers died. Only the practice remained. By the dawn of the 20th century, real change began to stir. Germ theory, antiseptics, and new understandings of disease finally pushed the old methods into the shadows. But they didn't vanish overnight. Some physicians clung to their ancient cures, now repackaged with cleaner names. Human-derived ingredients faded from labels, replaced by clinical terms. But the bones of the practice still sat in jars behind locked cabinets. It would take decades before science fully abandoned its cannibal past. And by then, the history had already been sanitized. Textbooks glossed over the human cost. Museums hid the ingredients. The horror was buried, not just in graveyards but in public memory. What remains is a silence too neat to be true, because if medicine is meant to heal, then Victorian medicine was something else entirely. A ritual, a gamble, a quiet, clinical horror story written in the blood of the desperate and the dead. This was not a dark corner of Victorian life. It was its very heart. Cannibal cures were not fringe, they were mainstream. They were respected, expected, and revered. And though we recoil today, the Victorians believed they were modern, cutting-edge, humane. That delusion cost countless lives. Their pursuit of progress led them straight into barbarism. And they did it with polished shoes, Latin names, and iron certainty. Behind every Victorian hospital door, a ghost still lingers. The ghost of a cure born in graveyards, fed by flesh, and buried beneath a century of silence. Chapter 2: Corpse Factories and the Resurrection Men. It always began in the dead of night. A rusted shovel scraped the edge of a fresh grave. Fog curled around the twisted trees of the cemetery, muffling footsteps and hiding faces. In the silence of slumbering London, men moved among the tombstones, not to mourn, but to steal. They were called resurrection men. They carried sacks, not flowers. Their customers were not grieving families, but surgeons, professors, and elite medical schools. The body beneath the soil was not sacred. It was a product, and the business was booming. As medicine advanced, so did the hunger for cadavers. Dissection became essential for training doctors, but the law allowed only a handful of legal corpses each year. That left a gap. A dark, rotting, lawless gap, and from that void rose an underworld industry built on stolen dead flesh. Hospitals needed them, universities paid handsomely, and cemeteries, once peaceful, became battlegrounds between the living and the desperate dead collectors. Graves were rarely safe for long, especially not fresh ones. Just hours after a funeral, resurrection men would strike. They worked in silence and with precision. A wooden coffin could be opened in minutes. The soil above lifted only at the head end. The body pulled out naked, limbs limp from rigor mortis. Clothes were often left behind. Stealing garments was a felony. Stealing a body was not. That legal loophole made it profitable. It made it quiet, and it made it thrive. Once loaded onto carts, the cadavers were wrapped in cloth and delivered to anatomy schools before dawn. Payment was prompt, no questions asked. Some doctors claimed they didn't want to know the source. Others paid extra for fresher specimens. Surgeons in training needed bodies to cut, to study, to understand. But no one spoke about where they came from, and no one asked who had been robbed of their final rest to supply that lesson. Families began to notice the violations. They found disturbed graves, caskets empty, headstones tilted, and grief turned to panic. Victorian cemeteries became fortresses. Iron cages called mortsafes were installed over graves. Watchmen were hired, dogs were posted. Some even built family tombs lined with metal to guard against the intruders. But it rarely worked. Money spoke louder than mourning. The resurrection men were relentless. Poorer communities suffered most. Their dead were often buried in shallow, unprotected plots. No one watched, no one resisted. In life, they were disposable. In death, profitable. And those who tried to protect their kin often faced ridicule or worse. Some families stood guard through the night, huddled beside flickering lanterns in the cold. Others set traps, but the robbers adapted. They came prepared, with bribes, with threats, with numbers. And so the night harvesting continued, quiet, hidden, just beneath the surface of Victorian society, literally and figuratively. A horror too lucrative to stop. Behind closed lecture hall doors, the bodies arrived. Cold, stiff, lifeless, but more valuable than gold. Young surgeons gathered around wooden tables, eager scalpels in hand. Professors spoke of progress, of science, of discovery. But they never mentioned the midnight theft that made it possible. The cadavers were anonymous, stripped of identity, laid bare for incisions, muscles peeled, organs weighed, brains sliced. And when one was used up, another followed, and another. Some were dissected for months, broken down piece by piece for the benefit of education. Others were used for public demonstrations, ticketed events where spectators watched as flesh was flayed and blood vessels traced. These were not crimes in the eyes of the elite. They were advancements, necessary sacrifices for medicine. But few paused to wonder who these people had been. No one asked their names, their families, their wishes. They were parts, pieces. A resource mined not from the earth, but from fresh graves under moonlight. But not all resurrection men limited themselves to graveyards. As demand rose, so did desperation. Some began creating the supply themselves. Victorians whispered about men who didn't wait for death, but delivered it. Victims were lured into alleyways or poisoned in pubs. Their bodies then sold under cover of darkness. These were not rumors. In Edinburgh, the infamous Burke and Hare scandal proved it could be done, and go undetected for months. The ripple effect was chilling. If a corpse could fetch more than a man's daily wage, what stopped someone from ensuring a body turned cold? The line between resurrection man and murderer blurred. And anatomy schools often looked the other way. They wanted bodies, not stories. And when confronted with the origin of a cadaver, the answer was always the same: silence. In this shadow economy, death had become an industry, and the product was flesh, harvested from both the careless dead and the unlucky living. The legal system struggled to keep pace. Parliament passed laws to limit grave robbing, but enforcement was weak. Police rarely caught the perpetrators, and even when they did, punishments were light. The real fear was public outrage, not justice. Medical institutions worried that exposure would destroy their reputation, so they protected the practice. They called it essential, noble, progressive. But behind the noble words was fear. Fear that, without corpses, the entire framework of medical education would collapse. That fear drove secrecy, bribery, complicity. Even priests were sometimes paid to look the other way. And while society praised the expanding knowledge of the human body, it refused to face the cost. Every textbook was stained with the unspoken. Every anatomy diagram built on stolen rest. And for every doctor who rose in fame, there was a family left wondering where their loved one had gone. Dug up, cut open, and never spoken of again. The rise of anatomy schools created corpse factories in everything but name. Institutions expanded, demand tripled, and the need for bodies became insatiable. They were dissected, preserved, pickled in jars. Some were even displayed in museums as educational tools. Skeletal remains labeled, categorized, and shown with pride. But none of them gave consent. None had voices. In life, many had been poor, voiceless, and ignored. In death, they became currency for a profession that prided itself on ethics. Students rarely questioned the process. To them, it was tradition, a rite of passage. The cold skin beneath their hands was a mystery to solve, not a story to hear. And so generation after generation of medical minds was shaped by the silence of the stolen. Corpses became case studies, their stories erased, and every preserved organ, every diagram on a wall, was another monument to the body trade the public pretended did not exist. Hospitals were not innocent bystanders. Some arranged secret deals with resurrection men, ensuring a steady flow of cadavers in exchange for payment or silence. A few even repurposed unclaimed bodies from their own morgues, failing to report them to families. Death records were altered, identities erased. The morgue became the final factory line. Death came in the front. Dissection left out the back. No questions, no dignity. Nurses whispered of patients who died mysteriously just before medical lectures. The coincidence was too sharp, and the money too tempting. For every ethical surgeon, there were others who saw the body as a tool, not a person. The more diseased, the better. More to study, more to show. These weren't fringe practices. They were institutional, endorsed by the highest circles. The operating table became both altar and butcher's block, and those who lay on it, willingly or not, were offered up in the name of knowledge and buried again in obscurity. Public suspicion boiled over by the mid-19th century. Protests erupted. Families stood guard at funerals. Pamphlets circulated, warning of grave robbers and killer doctors. Public dissection demonstrations were banned in several cities after riots broke out. Trust in medicine faltered. People feared hospitals not just for disease, but for what might happen after death. Some refused to admit dying relatives, fearing they'd vanish into an anatomy lab. It wasn't paranoia, it was experience. Too many had lost someone only to find an empty grave. Too many had heard rumors of medical students arriving with blood on their boots. The Victorian ideal of the wise doctor began to crack. Underneath the white coat, people saw shadows. Fear drove families to build mausoleums and iron-lined coffins. Death was no longer an end, but the start of a new kind of exploitation. And the living began to realize their bodies might be worth more cold than warm. The Anatomy Act of 1832 was the government's answer. It aimed to regulate the trade, allowing unclaimed bodies from hospitals and workhouses to be used legally for dissection. On paper, it ended the resurrection men. In practice, it legitimized the system. The poor, the orphaned, the forgotten, those who died without next of kin, were now automatically considered medical specimens. Their death certificate became a transfer slip, and the medical world no longer had to hide. They had law on their side, but dignity did not follow. The new source of bodies didn't silence the screams. It simply buried them deeper. Now, instead of digging up graves, surgeons waited for the destitute to die. And they always did. The corpse factories changed their supply chain, but the business was the same. The poor still paid in flesh, and the anatomy schools kept their doors open, their scalpels sharp, and their silence louder than ever before. Even today, traces of this macabre trade remain. University collections still hold bones, organs, and remains from the Victorian age, many unmarked, unidentified, and unacknowledged. Their stories remain untold, their names lost. Museums sometimes display skeletons without realizing or admitting how they were obtained. They are labeled with numbers, not histories, and though society has changed, the ghost of the resurrection men lingers. It whispers through the halls of medical schools, echoes beneath old cemeteries, and hides in glass cases under bright lights. The Victorian era saw medicine rise from superstition to science, but it did so on a mountain of stolen dead. And while modern medicine prides itself on ethics and consent, it rests on foundations built in silence. The surgeons are remembered, their contributions celebrated, but the bodies still forgotten, still unnamed, still laid bare on cold tables in the minds of history, cut open, dissected, and left behind, all in the name of progress. In the end, the resurrection men didn't just rob graves. They robbed peace, they robbed trust, and they robbed generations of their right to rest. Their hands weren't just on shovels. They were on history itself, digging up not just corpses, but the truth buried with them. The Victorian age called it necessity, advancement, education, but beneath the scalpel and behind the mask, it was still theft, still exploitation, still horror. It is a chapter written not in ink, but in bone. And every silent skull in a jar today still tells the same story, if anyone dares to listen. Chapter 3: The Hellish Truth of Workhouses. It was supposed to be a sanctuary for the poor, the sick, the elderly, and the desperate. The workhouse stood as a final refuge, a place where one could survive when all else was lost. But once the doors shut behind them, survival became a brutal test. Victorian workhouses were not places of mercy. They were institutions of punishment disguised as charity. Upon entry, families were torn apart, husbands separated from wives, mothers from children, the elderly cast into dim wards with strangers. This was not neglect. It was design. The system wanted to break the spirit of the poor, to make their suffering seem like their fault. Inside these walls, every breath cost dignity. Food was rationed like prison gruel. Silence was mandatory, beatings were routine, and the idea of escape, impossible. Not because of bars, but because the world outside offered nothing better. You either starved in the streets, or you withered in a workhouse cell. The daily routine began before dawn. Bells rang through the halls, echoing off stone walls that never warmed. Men were marched to workshops, women to laundry rooms or kitchens. Children, barely able to stand, were sent to scrub floors or peel vegetables until their hands bled. The work was endless. The hours stretched past exhaustion. But rest was not rewarded, it was punished. Anyone caught pausing was whipped or denied food. Beds were wooden planks. Blankets, if provided, were thin and crawling with lice. Illness spread like fire in these overcrowded spaces. Coughs echoed through every corridor. And yet the sick were expected to work until they dropped. Medical attention was rare and often deadly. The idea was to save money, not lives. Any sign of weakness was seen as laziness. And so the suffering continued, in silence and in shame. Outside, the city moved on. Inside, time froze around pain, despair, and the ticking clock of slow death. Children born into the workhouse had no chance. They were not seen as future citizens, but as burdens to be minimized. They grew up underfed, unloved, and unseen. Education, if it existed, was limited to obedience. Reading and writing were luxuries. Discipline was the priority. If they cried, they were beaten. If they resisted, they were locked away. Many were put to labor before they could spell their own names. Some were rented out to factories or farms. Others vanished entirely. Records were lost, names forgotten. What remained were bruises, malnourished bodies, and stunted minds. Childhood was stripped away layer by layer, replaced with fear and silence. And when they finally aged out, the world outside offered no mercy. Employers rejected them, society scorned them, and many returned to the very place they were born, in chains of poverty, circling back to the same cold halls that had stolen their innocence in the first place. For the elderly, the workhouse was a death sentence in slow motion. Widows, veterans, the infirm, those who had lived full lives, were reduced to shadows in overcrowded wards. They were given no comfort, no warmth, no final dignity. Conversations were discouraged. Laughing was banned. They sat for hours in silence, staring at stone walls, waiting for something that never came. Those who could not feed themselves went hungry. Those who soiled themselves were punished, not helped. Death often came quietly, unnoticed until the morning roll call. Bodies were wrapped in cloth and hauled away without ceremony. Few funerals were held. Fewer names were remembered. And for every elder who passed, another took their place. There was no rest in old age, only the slow erasure of identity. To grow old in a Victorian workhouse was to become invisible while still breathing. It was not a retirement. It was a prolonged goodbye, stretched painfully across months or even years. Women suffered differently, but no less cruelly. Unwed mothers were treated with scorn, their pregnancies seen as proof of moral failure. They were assigned the dirtiest jobs, punished more harshly, and constantly shamed. Infants born in workhouses often died within weeks. Malnourished and neglected, many were sent to baby farms. Private homes paid to raise them cheaply, which often meant no care at all. Stillbirths were common. The dead were buried in unmarked graves. No names, no mourning, and the mothers, they were expected to return to work the next day. Grief was weakness. Their tears dried in the laundry steam, their sorrow buried beneath back-breaking labor. Even married women who entered with husbands were separated, suspected of using the system. They became another mouth to feed, another body to break. Their stories rarely made it to the outside world. What happened in the female ward stayed there, lost behind locked doors and barred windows. The food, if it could be called that, was as cruel as the walls around them. Meals consisted of gruel, stale bread, and occasionally a thin broth. Nutrients were absent, flavor was banned. Eating became a chore, not a comfort. The portions were calculated not for survival, but for suppression. Too little to build strength, just enough to keep a person breathing. Hunger was a tool of control. Complain and your next portion shrank. Resist and you were denied altogether. Starvation became a quiet punishment, slowly gnawing at body and will. Some stole scraps when they could. Others collapsed from weakness mid-shift. And still, the overseers demanded more labor, more obedience. Food was not a right, it was a reward, one that could be taken at any moment. And so, each meal was swallowed with fear, the rumble of empty stomachs echoing louder than any protest. In this place, hunger was the master, and it never slept. Punishments in the workhouse were medieval in nature. Solitary confinement in pitch-black cells, flogging, cold water dousing, and starvation were all used to discipline. Infractions could be as simple as speaking out of turn or refusing to eat moldy bread. Children were beaten with rods. Women were stripped of blankets. Men were shackled and forced to kneel for hours. There was no appeal.
No fermis.
The overseers ruled with unchecked authority, often abusing their power for personal satisfaction. Whispers of sexual abuse echoed through the female wards, but few dared to speak. Complaints vanished. Victims were transferred or punished instead. Pain was a daily occurrence. Hope was contraband. And the worst part? These punishments were seen not as cruelty, but as correction. The logic was simple and monstrous. If the poor suffer enough, they'll stop being poor. The system believed in pain as transformation, in punishment as policy, and in silence as success. The workhouse was not broken. It was designed this way. The architecture itself was part of the cruelty. Long corridors stretched endlessly, walls stained with soot and sweat. Doors were heavy, locks clanked ominously. Windows were narrow slits, letting in only the barest sunlight. There was no comfort, no warmth, no softness. Everything was hard stone, iron, wood. Every surface reminded the inmate they were less than human. Privacy did not exist. Bathrooms were communal, often overflowing. Bedding was shared, disease traveled freely. And the sounds, the rattling chains, the barked orders, the coughs, the cries, never stopped. Even sleep was fractured by the cold or the screams of neighbors. The building itself seemed to conspire in the suffering. It was not built to shelter, but to suppress, to isolate, to crush, and it worked. The moment one entered, their identity began to fade. The person they had been before, worker, father, wife, child, was left at the door. Inside, they were only numbers, bodies, silence, waiting for the end. The shame of entering a workhouse clung like disease. Outside, the mere rumor that someone had once lived behind those walls was enough to destroy reputations. Employers turned away former inmates. Families disowned them. Charities ignored them. The poor had no choice but to hide their past or be judged for it forever. Even those who escaped often lived in fear of discovery. They knew what people thought, that workhouse inmates were lazy, criminal, or worse, that their suffering had been deserved. These beliefs were not just cruel, they were taught. Newspapers mocked the poor. Politicians insisted that suffering was necessary to deter dependency. And so the cycle of shame fed itself. No one wanted to talk about what really happened inside those walls. And those who had lived it rarely could. Their voices were silenced by starvation, by fear, and by the knowledge that no one would believe them anyway. Not all workhouses were identical. Some were worse. There were whispers of death rates so high, entire rooms were repurposed into morgues, of children buried in mass graves behind the buildings, of dark deals with hospitals and anatomy schools, where the dead were sold for dissection. Some workhouses quietly partnered with factories, leasing inmates as free labor under inhumane conditions. Oversight was minimal, corruption rampant. Inspectors rarely intervened. And when scandals did erupt, they were quickly buried under bureaucratic jargon. A few reforms came, too late, too slow. The system continued, adapting to criticism without changing its core cruelty. By the time the worst abuses came to light, generations had already been broken. Their stories, if remembered at all, were stripped of their horror, sanitized, forgotten, and yet the buildings still stood for decades. Ghosts trapped in brick and mortar, testaments to how society can twist help into harm and compassion into control. Even after the workhouses closed, their legacy remained. Survivors carried scars, emotional, physical, generational. Their children grew up wary, their grandchildren confused by the silence. Many never spoke of what they endured. Some blocked it out entirely, but the damage lived on, in poverty, in distrust, in a fear of authority that passed down like inheritance. The Victorian workhouse was not a temporary failure. It was a system engineered to maintain class control, to punish the poor for existing, and the echoes still linger in modern policies, in institutional apathy, in the cold way society still treats its most vulnerable. We like to believe such cruelty is behind us, that the past was barbaric, but we are better. But the truth is, until we face what was done, truly face it, the ghosts of the workhouse will never leave. They will whisper through welfare lines, through neglected care homes, through hungry children, and through every silent room where the suffering goes unseen. The workhouse was a machine, not of mercy, but of misery. It chewed up the weak, the poor, the unwanted, and spit out shells. It was a place where compassion was stripped away, replaced by numbers and rules, where love died and routine reigned. Victorian society believed it was solving poverty by punishing it. They were wrong. They didn't end hunger. They institutionalized it. And in doing so, they left behind a blueprint of systemic cruelty. One that hid behind stone walls and iron gates. One that still lurks beneath the surface of modern bureaucracy. And one that must be remembered, not with reverence, but with rage. Because the truth of the workhouse isn't a story about the past. It's a warning about what happens when dignity is forgotten, when help becomes harm, and when society turns its back on the people it promised to protect. Chapter 4: The Sewers Beneath Society. At night, when gaslights flickered out and London streets emptied, a different world came alive beneath the cobblestones. Here, in narrow tunnels slick with filth, rivers of human waste coursed toward the Thames. The stench rose through gaps in pavement, a silent poison stalking the city. Rats as big as cats scuttled across fetid sediments, feasting on discarded entrails and the bones of the destitute. Men who ventured below carried lanterns that did little to cut through the darkness or the fear. They spoke in low tones, aware that every breath risked cholera, typhoid, or worse. And worse was everywhere. Bodies floated in the toxic flow, unclaimed victims of poverty, disease, or accident. They drifted along the tunnels until they clogged drains or washed into the river itself. Above ground, Victorians strolled along elegant quays, oblivious to the decay below. They believed progress had conquered nature. They were wrong. The underworld sewers would prove how close death truly ran behind their polished facades. Cholera arrived in London like a phantom. No one saw it coming. It struck families without warning. Mothers dropped infants in their arms. Workers collapsed into convulsions at factory gates. The Board of Health scrambled for answers, but theories clashed like swords in the dark. Blame was cast on miasma, bad air rising from swamps and refuse. Politicians urged citizens to clean their yards. Doctors prescribed aromatic herbs and breathing exercises. Meanwhile, beneath every street, the real culprit festered in secret. Raw sewage clogged old pipes built for rainwater, overflowing into cellars and wells. Every rainstorm became a death sentence for the poor who drank from contaminated sources. And so the cholera waves rolled on, first in one district, then another, claiming thousands within days. It was not nature's wrath, but human design. A broken system built on ignorance, arrogance, and blind faith in progress. The streets above remained clean. The river remained a prize. But beneath them, London was drowning in its own filth. Investigations into the death toll uncovered horrors beyond counting. Surveyors descended into tunnels, scribbling notes amid rotting bundles of clothes and fragments of bone. They found children's toys tangled in sludge, reminders that the misfortune below struck every social layer, though the poor suffered most. Every inch of pipe told a story of neglect. Some drains ran straight from workhouse toilets into the river. Others emptied onto public streets when they clogged, leaving public walkways slick with effluent and bacteria. Citizens who lived near such leaks fell ill repeatedly. Entire families perished while the gentry remained untouched. The gulf between rich and poor shimmered in the green ribbons of contamination that traced every slope toward the river. Politicians promised reforms, but nothing moved faster than the stench. Londoners held their noses in markets, refused to drink Thames water, and resorted to imported springs. Yet each sip carried its own risk. Suspicion grew that the city's core pulse throbbed with invisible death, nourishing the population below with every breath. Despite mounting evidence, those in power chose silence. Embarrassment outweighed action. The board of whistleblowers faced stone walls. Proposals to overhaul the system were dismissed as too costly, too radical. London's economy thrived on trade, and no one dared close the docks or halt commerce to lay new pipes. Fear of panic drove officials to downplay each outbreak. Newspapers printed reassurances. The water was safe, the air pure. But the headlines could not hide the coffins stacking up in churchyards. Bodies were buried faster than workers could dig graves. Mass funerals became routine, often held at night to avoid alarming the public. Mourning became a ritual of hushed tones and veiled faces. But the truth lurked in the labyrinth below. Every drain, every trapdoor, every cracked brick hid the secret that death flowed freely under the world's greatest empire city. And the only remedy was courage, innovation, and a reckoning with pride. A small group of engineers refused to be silenced. They mapped the arteries of the underground, tracing each sewage line back to its source. They devised massive brick tunnels to carry waste far downstream. They argued that, for public health, the river must be cleansed. Their designs were ambitious. Mile upon mile of conduits laid beneath the busiest streets. Criticism rained down. Merchants feared disruption. Landowners feared noise and dust. Politicians feared cost overruns. But in the face of yet another deadly outbreak, the city corporation agreed to trials. Workers tunneled by hand, carving out passages through clay and stone. They named the project the Great Sewage Overhaul. Every pickaxe blow echoed with hope and dread. Hope that the city might finally breathe clean air. Dread at what they would uncover as they dug deeper. Beneath the veneer of Victorian order lay centuries of filth, waiting to see daylight for the first time. Construction was a horror show in its own right. Tunnels collapsed under pressure. Men were trapped and crushed. The air in the new sewers was so toxic that workers fainted from hydrogen sulfide. Rescue teams battled darkness and stench to pull survivors from beneath tons of earth. Corpses of mice and cats clogged the lines, adding to the noxious brew. Some tunnels ran beneath graveyards, and bones crumbled through the mortar. One worker described feeling skull fragments under his boots. It was a land of eternal night, where every breath burned lungs and poisoned mind. Yet the work pressed on. Engineers inspected every joint. Supervisors measured flow rates. Politicians congratulated themselves in boardrooms while posters lauded modern London's triumph over disease. But the true victory belonged to the laborers who crawled inch by inch through misery, driven by the unspoken hope that one day their suffering would save lives above. And as bricks formed into arches, the river began to see less of the city's secrets. By the time the network was complete, London had spent massive sums. The new sewers soared beneath the Grand Boulevard and spread like roots under every district. Combined with flushing systems and new reservoirs, they transformed the capital. Cholera vanished as dramatically as it had arrived. Wells ran clear. The river regained some of its former grace. Politicians hailed the victory as proof of Victorian ingenuity. Statues were erected, plaques unveiled. Yet few commemorated the thousands of laborers who had died underground or the poor who had suffered when reforms came too late. Instead, monuments celebrated empire, industry, and progress. The underlying truth remained hidden. When health was restored above, it cost lives below. The city's resurrection from disease was paid in sweat, bone, and blood. And while London moved forward into a new era, the tunnels beneath held onto their shadows, reminding any who dared to descend that civilization often builds its triumphs on the backs of the unseen. The sewers also carried more than human waste. They carried diseased corpses secreted by families who could not afford funerals. They carried opium paraphernalia and stolen jewelry meant to be washed clean. They carried the hollow-eyed bodies of victims dumped by hospitals too afraid of scandal. In that underworld, every relic of Victorian life washed through. Fragments of letters, relics of domestic life, and the tears of families who lost loved ones too quickly. Archaeologists decades later would dredge up bottles and tins of remedies once believed miraculous, now worn down by time and water. In the tunnels, nothing decayed alone. Everything converged in one unstoppable flood, material evidence of society's failures, tragedies, and lies. Politicians moved on to other battles, trade tariffs, colonial campaigns, and city expansions. They praised the sewers as a closed chapter, but the memory of the Great Stink lingered for decades. In Parliament, windows were kept shut to block the odor during heated debates. The Thames was blackened by film of scum that refused to be washed away. The world watched, aghast, as London overcame its own filth. Cities across Europe and America modeled their systems after the new underground network. The Victorian sewer became a blueprint for public health. Yet no one warned them of the dangers of neglecting maintenance. Decades later, blockages and collapses would claim lives again. Proof that infrastructure, like society, must be maintained with care. Progress was not a one-time victory. It was an ongoing battle against entropy, against forgetfulness, against the temptation to ignore the foundations that keep cities alive. In the years after, writers and artists romanticized Victorian London. Gaslit streets, fog-draped corners, grand bridges over the glittering Thames. They never painted the sewers tunnels. They never told of the rivers of rot flowing beneath. They preferred the glittering facade, and so the public forgot. School children learned of steam engines and railways, of empire, industry, and great architects. They seldom studied the underbelly of it all. Yet the lessons remained vital. When society turns its back on unsavory truths, they fester. When the poorest are ignored, disease finds a foothold. When fear outweighs action, death triumphs. The sewers beneath Victorian streets were more than infrastructure. They were a metaphor for a city's soul, struggling between brilliance and decay, illuminated by progress, but dark at its core unless tended with honesty and compassion. Today, modern London flushes without thought, while thousands of steel and concrete tunnels quietly carry waste eastward into treatment plants. Few know their routes. Fewer still remember why they were built. Yet each time it rains heavily, any crack in the system reminds the city of its past. A flooding street gutter can smell of history. A backed-up drain can hint at the old tunnels beneath. And every cloudy bay near the Thames whispers the story of a time when human folly turned ingenuity into horror. The next time rainwater mixes with sewage, the city faces a choice. Ignore the smell and walk on, or pause and remember that the foundations of progress must be guarded. Because even the greatest achievements can unravel when society refuses to look down, and when it forgets the ghosts beneath its feet. The tale of Victorian sewers is a dark mirror to modern life. It shows how easily comfort can mask catastrophe, how elegance can rest on decay, and how political pride can delay salvation at a dreadful cost. Beneath our feet, history still flows. Every drop of rainwater merges with the legacy of neglect unless we heed its warnings. The story of the sewers beneath society is not just a chapter in a book. It is a living lesson, urging each generation to confront the hidden, to speak the unspeakable, and to build with both courage and conscience. Because if we fail to tend the foundations, every glittering street above can become a tomb. Chapter 5: The Dark Secrets of Victorian Asylums. Behind tall walls and iron gates, Victorian asylums promised refuge and relief. But the moment patients crossed the threshold, hope drained away. Corridors stretched like tombs. The air tasted of disinfectant and fear. Guards in starched uniforms guided newcomers into locked wards. Each door clanged shut like a verdict. No visitor could stay long. Families dropped off their own, too ashamed to linger. Staff numbers were thin and empathy rarer still. Most attendants viewed patients as beasts to be caged. Records described madness in broad strokes: dangerous, unpredictable, incurable. Few dared question the labels. Insanity was a stigma and a secret. From the outside, asylums stood as symbols of progress. Inside, they were factories of suffering. Patients were cataloged by symptom. Treatments followed formula, not understanding. Those deemed incurable were forgotten. The walls absorbed their screams and hid them from polite society. In these institutions, madness was not treated. It was manufactured, controlled, and concealed. Wards were organized by gender, then by diagnosis in shorthand. The melancholic whispered prayers until handcuffs silenced them. The agitated thrashed against padded walls, only to be sedated or strapped down. In the women's wing, hysteria was the diagnosis of choice for any inconvenient emotion. A daughter's grief, a wife's defiance, a widow's longing, all pathologized and punished. Men committed for dissent, for debts, even for refusing marriage. Children born within asylum walls were never registered as legitimate. Their existence counted for little. Food was allocated by status, better cuts for staff, thin gruel for patients. Clothing was uniform, shapeless gowns that erased identity. Beds were iron-framed and narrow. Privacy did not exist. Every movement logged, every sound monitored. In this world, the different were the deadliest. Those who questioned the institution's power risked their minds. And so most patients learned silence. The first treatments were inspired by brutal simplicity. Fresh air in isolation cells, cold plunges in icy baths. The theory was to shock the body and reset the mind. Suffering, they claimed, would cure suffering. Attendants forced reluctant patients into bathhouses at dawn. The water was so frigid it numbed limbs and sent shock through every nerve. Some lost consciousness. Others drowned under the weight of linen and shivering limbs. Those who survived returned to wards weakened, disoriented, not healed. Bloodletting made a comeback. Veins were punctured to drain alleged poisons. Leeches were applied in rows, their bites leaving wounds that festered into ulcers. And oxygen tents filled with faintly sweet air. Another experiment in sensory deprivation left patients gasping or catatonic. These were not fringe practices. They were the standard. And at every step, families believed that silence meant safety, that no news was good news. But behind every treatment lay scars deeper than flesh. Hydrotherapy soon evolved into mechanized torture. Patients were strapped to tubs that tilted, drenching them in cold or scalding water. The process repeated until collapse. Steam rooms baked the weak until delirium set in. Some attendants chained bodies upright in metal chairs equipped with water jets. Spasms of water lashed skin, leaving patients rock-hard with chills or burns. The machines hissed and rattled. Staff watched gauges more than faces. The more extreme the reaction, the more effective the treatment seemed. Reports touted improved behavior, less resistance. But at what cost? Permanent damage to organs, broken bones, and mental breakdowns were common. Injuries were chalked up to improving temperament. And when patients emerged shaking, they were labeled cured enough to join labor wards. Modern readers recoil, but for Victorians, the spectacle of hydrotherapy was progress. Science over superstition, authority over autonomy. Inside locked wings, those who did not respond were hidden away. Quiet rooms existed where patients who spoke too often were silenced permanently. They vanished from public roles. Attendants transferred them to underground cells lit by a single lamp. No windows, no human contact. Days bled into nights. Food arrived through small slots. Visitors never saw these wards. And the patients, deemed hopeless, slowly faded. Asylum inspectors rarely ventured there. When they did, the staff covered empty beds with straw dummies to fool them. Records were falsified, names crossed out. Death certificates issued under false pretenses. Families sometimes received notice of a peaceful passing. In reality, their relative might still be alive, but broken beyond recognition. The asylum administration was a closed system. No one held it accountable. and so the dark rooms swallowed souls without consequence. Mental asylums doubled as workhouses for the inconvenient. Patients were made to sew, polish floors, or break stones in prison-like yards. The labor was intended to occupy their minds. In practice, it was free workforce. The infirm got crumbs and cold tasks. The able-bodied labored for hours under harsh overseers. Injuries from hammers and sewing machines were common. No compensation was given. Productivity quotas replaced therapy sessions. Patients who slowed down were accused of malingering and punished. The richest institutions made profits by selling goods produced in-house. Thus the cycle continued. Label someone insane, lock them away, exploit their labor, then erase them from the system once broken. Victorian society applauded the efficiency. Few asked if forced labor could break bodies as effectively as chains. And so, families desperate enough to relinquish their loved ones unwittingly contributed to their demise. Beneath clinical reports lay stories of abuse, whispers of beatings in secluded yards, rumors of sexual assault denied by authorities. Attendants exploited power imbalances. Women were vulnerable in night shifts when only 2 guards patrolled long hallways. Requests for transfers went unanswered. Complaints lost in labyrinthine bureaucracy. Records showed no injuries. The culture of silence was brutal. Patients feared retaliation. Families feared scandal. And doctors prioritized reputation over truth. One exposed scandal could bring down an entire asylum. As a result, evidence was buried. Bones in pauper graves, bruises under hospital gowns, and half-mad confessions scrawled on scraps of paper. All remained hidden. The institutional veil was thick, and while reformers spoke of compassion, the everyday reality was cruelty protected by stone walls and official indifference. Occasional exposés by reformers opened a crack in the asylum's armor. Pamphlets circulated describing padded cells and ice baths. Public outrage flared. Committees formed. But government action was timid. New regulations mandated registers and periodic inspections. Yet inspectors were often allied with the institutions they oversaw. Bribes and social ties blunted their criticism. Rules existed on paper, not in practice. Asylums continued to operate on fear and suppression. And while a handful of enlightened doctors introduced occupational therapy and gardens, these remained luxuries reserved for the few. Most patients stayed trapped in cycles of violence disguised as care. The occasional reformer was celebrated as a hero, but the system swallowed them too, wearing down goodwill with entrenched tradition. The link between asylums and class prejudice ran deep. Working-class patients faced harsher conditions. Middle and upper-class inmates had relatives who lobbied for private wards and more humane treatments. Charitable donations funded separate gentlemen's corridors with books and fresh air. Those with means could avoid straitjackets, padded cells, and bitter tonics. The poor got the worst. No charity for them. They were repositories for social failures, drunks, dissenters, and the destitute. Labeling poverty as madness freed society from responsibility. Outsourcing the problem to asylums absolved communities of guilt. And so the majority of patients remained unseen, unheard, and uncounted. Their suffering sustained the illusion that madness belonged only to them, not to a society that chose to hide its inconvenient burdens. By the turn of the century, public perception began to shift. Medical journals published temperance tales of moral treatment, praising kindness and routine. Gardens bloomed in pamphlets. Asylum architecture in watercolor glowed with sunlight. But the ink could not erase the bones in unmarked pauper graves, nor could it undo the scars etched on survivors' minds. Many former patients emerged shaky and distrustful, haunted by the memory of locked wards and dripping taps. They were offered no rehabilitation.
No reintegration.
Society viewed them with suspicion. Madness remained a taboo. The asylum's doors opened for new generations of the vulnerable, and the cycle of neglect and abuse resumed. Headlines celebrated medical progress above. The darker history waited behind locked doors. Modern psychiatry owes its roots to Victorian asylums, but so does its darker heritage. The steel doors, shivering patients, and steam baths of the past became the chemical restraints and locked wards of the present. Institutional care evolved, but the tension between freedom and containment persists. Ethics boards and patient rights movements emerged to address past wrongs. Yet psychiatric patients today still face stigma and involuntary treatment. When history repeats itself, it does so quietly. Victorian asylums were a warning that good intentions can yield cruelty without accountability, that power imbalances endanger the powerless, and that society's desire to hide its unwanted can turn institutions into instruments of harm. The story of Victorian asylums remains a cautionary tale. It reminds us that treating the mind demands empathy as much as therapy, that confinement can masquerade as care, that medical authority must be tempered by human rights, and that the vulnerable deserve voices, not silence. The gates remain, metaphorically, around those deemed mad. It falls on each generation to unlock them with compassion, scrutiny, and unwavering demand for dignity. Only then can we ensure that the dark secrets of the past do not become the shadows of our present. Chapter 6: Child Labor and the Machines That Ate Them. In the dawn light of industrial towns, a procession of small bodies shuffled to the factories. Their faces were pale, eyes sunken from hunger and exhaustion. They were children, some barely 10, yet their hands were calloused and stained with coal dust. They trudged past looming brick chimneys that belched smoke into gray heavens, past clanking looms and roaring steam engines. Each morning they stepped into narrowing corridors of machinery designed without mercy. Gears spun without guards, belts whirred overhead, and the slightest misstep could cost a finger, a hand, or a life. Their masters called it efficiency. Parents, desperate for meager wages, called it survival. The youngest crawled beneath massive presses to oil hidden bolts. Older ones hauled sacks of coal, their backs bending under unbearable weight. They worked 12, 14, 16 hours each day. Their bodies shrank from the strain, but fear of hunger kept them silent. The machines demanded sacrifice, and the children paid in blood. In textile mills, the air was thick with fine cotton fibers that settled in lungs like snowdrifts. Girls with slender arms fed spindles at breakneck speed, afraid to pause for breath. Their supervisors prowled the galleries, cane in hand, watching fingernails slip or threads snap. A single dropped bobbin could earn a blow or the lash of a leather strap. Children learned to fear the machine's rhythm, to move with its deadly cadence or be crushed by it. They became extensions of iron and wood, bodies marrying technology in a dance of pain. Breaks were scarce. Meals were hurried bites of bread and water. Illness was blamed on laziness rather than toxic dust. When coughing children collapsed, overseers shoved them aside to make room for the next. In that inferno of productivity, childhood was a luxury none could afford. Beneath the earth, in the coal mines, another horror lurked. The tunnels swallowed daylight, and the children became shadows themselves. Their job was to guide heavy wagons of coal along iron rails gripped by small hands. At 9, they crawled through narrow passages too low for adults, carting tub after tub to waiting locomotives. The air was laden with dust that choked lungs and blackened skin. Explosions of fire damp killed without warning, collapsing roof timbers in deafening crashes. Yet the boys, known as hurriers and trappers, pressed on. They lit lamps that flickered against jagged walls, signaling their presence to those who waited at surface shafts. Hunger gnawed at their bellies in the dim tunnels, but they dared not stop. The moment they froze, danger closed in, and so they moved, tiny bodies carrying mountains of coal in an endless cycle that eroded bone and spirit. Urban streets teemed with news of these young laborers. Reports described bruised knuckles and crushed limbs, yet reformers' voices were drowned by factory owners' profits. Legislation promised protection, limiting work hours for children under 13, but enforcement was lax. Factory inspectors numbered too few to oversee thousands of workshops. Owners paid fines as a cost of business and continued extracting labor from the smallest workers. In country villages, no inspectors came at all. The children labored on, unseen and uncounted. Each lost finger or broken arm was recorded as an accident, not a crime. Families remained too afraid to speak. They depended on wages for even a crust of bread. The result was a system that tolerated horror in the name of production. A world where progress ate innocence for breakfast. Schoolhouses, when they existed, offered only fleeting reprieve. Some mill owners built rudimentary classrooms, claiming they valued education. But lessons were candles burned in the margins of work schedules. Children were summoned back to the machines at the first sign of profit loss. Their minds grew dull from fatigue and fear. Reading and writing became burdens blamed on laziness or natural inferiority rather than the result of endless shifts. Communities learned to accept child labor as normal. Generations were shaped by gear teeth and coal seams, not by books or play. Childhood became an illusion, a memory too distant to yearn for. And the machines continued their relentless hum, feeding on bodies too young to protest or protect themselves. In iron foundries, boys stoked immense furnaces that glowed brighter than the noonday sun. They shoveled coke and coal into roaring mouths of fire, their faces pressed close to blistering heat. Protective gear was unheard of. Skin blistered, eyes watered, lungs burned with each intake of acrid smoke. Powdered ash coated the floor in fine layers that shifted under bare feet, turning every step treacherous. One misstep could send a child tumbling into molten metal. Yet the demands of production allowed no hesitation. Boy laborers were prized. They were cheaper, smaller, and more compliant than adults. Their wages, pocket change at best, made them attractive commodities. In the inferno, they melted fearlessly like steel, and families watched in silence, knowing that without those pennies, survival was impossible. In the cotton mills of Lancashire and Yorkshire, the youngest were known as scavengers. Their task was to crawl under machines to gather loose cotton tufts, risking life for tiny rewards. A sudden motion of the mule could sever a leg in seconds. But scavengers worked on, bodies bleeding, for the promise of a penny per handful. Supervisors kept score of their output, praising the fastest while turning away the injured. The machine's music, the rhythmic clatter of looms, was a lullaby of death, soothing children into complicity. They learned to see danger as ordinary, to measure success not by safety, but by speed. Childhood aspirations of future careers were replaced by dreams of surviving the next week. And so factory floors became arenas of perpetual hazard, where risks multiplied with each passing hour. The public sometimes caught glimpses of these horrors. A boy hobbling home with a scarred leg, a girl with soot-blackened hair weeping over a crushed hand. Outsiders gasped, then looked away. Sympathy was fleeting, compassion was inconvenient. The next day, factories resumed as if nothing had happened. Local newspapers published obituaries briefly, but many children died unrecorded, their names lost amid the toll of industrial fatalities. Their deaths were statistics, not tragedies. And while philanthropic societies petitioned for change, factory owners countered with threats of closures that would plunge entire towns into destitution. The moral dilemma twisted into a debate about economic necessity versus humane labor, and the children remained caught in the crossfire, paying with flesh for every bolt turned, every rope wound, every shutter stitched. One small spark of hope burned in the 1840s with the Factory Acts, gradually tightening restrictions on child labor. Hours were clipped, schooling mandated, ages raised. Yet every new law left loopholes. Children swapped jobs between factories, worked for subcontractors, or disguised themselves as older siblings. Employers found ways around decrees, valuing profit over principle. Inspectors uncovered violations but lacked authority to enforce full compliance. The children adapted too, learning to tell doctors they were older, to bite their tongues, and to cover bruises with soot. The system fed their resilience. But resilience is not relief. For every step forward, the march of exploitation found a new path. And child bodies continued to fuel the furnace of progress beneath the Victorian skyline. By century's end, the legacy of child labor remained etched in bone and memory. Former mill children grew into adults with arthritic joints, damaged lungs, and fractured spines. Their short lives had begun in darkness and ended with chronic pain. Yet they seldom spoke of their past. They had learned to bear suffering in silence. Their stories faded into folklore, warnings told in hushed tones to new generations tempted by factory doors. At industrial fairs, the polished machines gleamed, celebrated as marvels. The people who had powered them were gone or forgotten. Communities honored inventors and entrepreneurs, not the anonymous hands that coaxed life from iron and steam. Progress was immortalized in bronze statues. The child laborers were commemorated only by the scars they carried. The story of Victorian child labor is a testament to endurance and injustice. It reveals how industrial ambition consumed the vulnerable, and how society justified exploitation in the name of advancement. Children became raw material for an economy that prized efficiency over empathy. And while modern laws forbade such practices, echoes remain wherever labor goes unchecked and the powerless are silenced. This chapter stands as a warning. When profit outweighs protection, the youngest become the greatest victims. The machines may evolve, but their appetite for unguarded flesh persists wherever vigilance fades. We must remember their sacrifice, not as relics of a bygone era, but as a call to defend the dignity of every worker, no matter how small. Chapter 7: The Forgotten Crime of Human Zoos. In grand exhibition halls under shimmering gaslight, crowds gathered to witness displays of savage cultures imported at great expense. Victorian elites clinked champagne glasses as tribespeople stood in cages, their bodies painted with ritual designs and adorned with feathers and shells. On wooden platforms, they sang unfamiliar songs while curious onlookers snapped caricature sketches. Promoters touted these spectacles as scientific curiosities, a way to study human diversity. But the true purpose was darker: to reinforce notions of European superiority by parading primitive peoples for entertainment. These exhibitions stretched across Europe and America, drawing millions through turnstiles. Men, women, and children from Africa, Asia, and the Pacific Islands were ripped from their homelands, stripped of dignity, and displayed as living curiosities. They slept in cramped quarters backstage, often guarded like prisoners. When not on display, they were prodded to perform by handlers chasing coins thrown by spectators. And when they resisted, punishment followed. This was the human zoo, a spectacle of empire built on dehumanization. Recruiters scoured colonial outposts, promising participants adventure and riches. Families agreed, persuaded by handsome advances and tales of distant lands. Yet few understood the horror awaiting them. Once aboard creaking steamships, they were confined in steerage, fed meager rations, and subjected to diseases unknown in their native homes. Many fell ill, and medical care was minimal. Upon arrival, they were paraded before customs officials who measured skulls, examined teeth, and recorded height, scientists seeking racial proof. These measurements were used to justify hierarchy and oppression. Promoters signed their names on contracts that stripped away rights. The moment they stepped onto exhibition grounds, they lost autonomy. Handlers controlled their every move. They wore borrowed costumes, not their own. They adopted staged customs invented for amusement. And the audiences, convinced they witnessed authentic culture, cheered. The reality that these people were pawns in a brutal show remained hidden behind smiles and applause. Victorian newspapers advertised authentic native villages erected in city parks. Audiences paid for guided tours through huts stocked with savages going about daily life. Children were presented as ambassadors of lost tribes, urged to smile and wave for coins. The so-called villagers were forced to fish in muddy ponds, grind grain on stones, or demonstrate ritual dances under blistering sun and biting chill. There was no rest. Every action was orchestrated for the gaze of the curious. Visitors took souvenirs, feathers, shells, carved figures, made from materials stolen alongside the people. Photographers snapped stiff, uncomfortable portraits, later sold as postcards. These images became proof of colonial triumph, circulated widely. Few questioned the ethics. Few considered the trauma inflicted. And fewer still spoke of the torn families and ruined lives behind the spectacle. In this manufactured village, dignity was replaced by display. Behind the scenes, organizers monitored every movement. Guards carried clubs. Electric fences and padlocks kept exhibits from wandering off or escaping abuse. Sanitation was poor. Disease spread quickly among captive communities. Medical officers assigned by colonial offices visited occasionally, more concerned with preventing scandal than providing care. Treatments were experimental, painful, and often lethal. Patients who died were sometimes replaced by freshly recruited captives, their deaths unrecorded. Bodies of the deceased were cremated or shipped back to Europe for anatomical study, another form of exploitation. Promoters wrote off deaths as inevitable, labeling them tropical illnesses, and families at home rarely learned of the real fate of their loved ones. Children were orphaned in foreign lands. Elders passed away in loneliness, far from sacred burial grounds. The cost of empire was counted in human lives, not currency. Yet the exhibitions continued, profits rising with public appetite for imperial spectacle. Public opposition was rare but existed. Abolitionists and early human rights campaigners decried the exploitation, calling for laws against human exhibitions. Petitions circulated among intellectual circles, and occasional riots broke out when captive performers resisted. Some towns banned these shows outright, yet governments hesitated, fearing economic fallout and accusations of stifling scientific research. Museums built anthropology collections from objects seized during recruitment. Scientific societies published glowing reports on racial types exhibited at zoos, lending academic legitimacy. Even religious leaders argued these displays spread knowledge of distant lands and peoples. And so the human zoos persisted under a cloak of respectability. Few dared to challenge the empire's narrative. While voices of dissent rose, they were drowned by the roar of gaslights and the clatter of carriage wheels ferrying spectators to the next show. Children were the most vulnerable. In one British exhibition, a 10-year-old boy from West Africa was displayed as the child of the cannibal tribe. He was forced to enact staged rituals with fake weapons, owned by handlers who snapped whips when he faltered. His parents, far away, received rumors of his improvements, never suspects of the misery backstaging the glamour. Other children labored backstage, cleaning cages, preparing meals, sewing costumes, all unpaid. They lived in unheated barracks, scared of the crowds. Many tried to escape into city streets but were caught and beaten. The trauma they endured left lifelong scars. Few received any support upon return home, if they ever returned. Those who did found their communities changed, their traditions lost. They were neither here nor there, and neither world embraced them. Their childhood ended under the unforgiving glare of public spectacle. The peak of human zoos coincided with world's fairs, massive international exhibitions celebrating industrial progress. Amid displays of steam engines and telegraphs, human exhibits reinforced racial hierarchies. These were the real attractions for many visitors. Families treated the zoos as entertainment between scientific pavilions. Schools organized field trips. Newspapers published excited accounts of natives walking among us. Souvenir guidebooks listed the whereabouts of each group. The urban elite attended in top hats and bustles, oblivious to the moral stain on their society. And politicians gave speeches praising cultural exchange, never mentioning the violence behind it. In the name of education, empire displayed its conquered subjects like trophies, and the world applauded. As the 19th century waned, criticism grew louder. Journalists infiltrated exhibitions, interviewing captive performers in broken English. They exposed living conditions, the contracts, the deaths. Cartoons in reformist papers lampooned the absurdity of people in cages, suggesting Europeans were no better than animals. Public opinion shifted slowly. Some museums dismantled human exhibits. Parliaments debated bans. But promoters fought back, claiming science would suffer. Laws passed, but enforcement lagged. Shows migrated to less regulated provinces or across oceans to North America. The victims endured longer. While Europe professed humanitarian progress, business interests resisted. The human zoo survived into the 20th century in various forms: colonial exhibitions, traveling shows, anthropology displays in fairs. And with each rollback, organizers refined tactics, rebranding captive people as cultural ambassadors to skirt new regulations. The legacy of human zoos persists in unexpected ways. Ethnographic museums still display objects taken from those exhibitions, often without context or consent. Photographs hang on walls, frozen moments masking coercion. Archives hold recruitment contracts and medical reports verifying exploitation. Few institutions publicly acknowledge this history. Educational programs gloss over the horrors, focusing on architecture and technological wonders of world's fairs. The lessons of human zoos remain buried beneath layers of sanitized narrative. But descendants of those exhibited peoples carry memories of displacement and stigma. They speak of ancestors forced into performance, stripped of agency and identity. These stories passed down in families remind us of the cost of spectacle when profit outweighs humanity. Today, the idea of a human zoo seems unimaginable. Yet modern parallels exist in reality TV, in exploitative media coverage of indigenous communities, in the trafficking of vulnerable populations for entertainment or profit. The machinery may be digital instead of iron, but the principle remains: marginalized people displayed for majority amusement. It underscores a persistent temptation to dehumanize the other to feed curiosity. This chapter ends not in triumph but in warning. The ghost of the human zoo demands vigilance. It reminds us that progress without ethics can revert to barbarism, and that only by acknowledging the full truth, no matter how ugly, can society ensure such a crime never repeats. The cages have been dismantled, but their shadows stretch long. Statues built to celebrate empire may still stand in public squares. Museums maintain glass cases filled with artifacts of colonial collection. And in the quiet rooms of archives, the contracts and ledgers record the trade in bodies once deemed exhibitions. The crimes of human zoos are buried not in unmarked graves, but in cultural amnesia. To remember is to honor those who suffered, to give voices to the silenced. It is to understand that the greatest horrors can be masked by gaslight and applause. Only by confronting this legacy can we dismantle the remnants of dehumanization that persist in our modern world.